Good afternoon. You may be seated. Thank you for that very kind and warm reception. Really appreciate it. My real name is Mahlatse. I thought I'll take a dig at Pastor Phil, but grateful to be here, grateful to have received this amazing input. I am originally from Bushbuckridge. For those of you who know where that is, it's in Mpumalanga. It used to be in Limpopo. We were joking earlier on. It used to be in Limpopo, but is now in Mpumalanga. What happened one day, I left for school. Bushbuckridge was in Limpopo, and then I came back for holidays, and I was told, you now live in Mpumalanga. But such is an exciting country that we live in South Africa, that today you might say, and be careful, Pastor Phil, it's like, hey, Hillsong, nice building in Century City in the Western Cape. You might go for a holiday and come back. It's like, yeah, it's still Century City, but Century City is now in the Northern Cape, So you've got to keep a track of some of these amazing things that are happening. But I've been incredibly blessed just to hear and receive input from our two speakers this morning, and just to get plugged into the big picture of what's going on, and I think the meta picture of some of the trends, some of the cultural trends, to take note and to be able to also find that our hope, the hope that I have, that many of us share, also is relevant within that big picture. But also, enjoyed listening also to Marius bringing it down to South Africa as well. And I'm going to even try and narrow it down, maybe even to the personal level, and speak to us on a level of social imagery. What we're talking about we're talking about everyday heroes. I wrote that living in South Africa sometimes feels like having a front row seat, listening to an orchestra that's playing uncoordinated music. Sometimes really, really good. There's the good, and then there's the stuff that makes you anxious. There's the stuff that gives you a little bit of anxiety within our social narratives. The good stuff, the stuff that makes us laugh, that makes us take jabs at one another. You think about, some of the stuff that we're trying to work out, racially, for instance. I like to poke fun at some of my friends, as we were doing with Pastor Phil, with other people like Lawrence as well. And we're sitting down and taking jabs and saying, I think what you just said there, Lawrence, I don't know if you would get away, with saying something like that if you were just black, man. That's just a white safe thing to say, And the other day I was saying to my friend who told me, a white friend who said to me, I'm not a very strong swimmer. I looked at him, I said, man, you're a disgrace to your stereotype, But then he turns around, and sometimes if you give it, you've got to be willing to take it, because the same guy turns around and says, well, can you pick a lock? I say, no. He says, well, you're a disgrace to your stereotype. If you give it, you've got to be able to take it, right? But these are some of the things that makes us, be proud of being in this country. Some of the diversity that we find. Another one, for instance, is this idea of funeral. I was thinking about funerals in South Africa. The idea of how different, we do funerals. Black funerals are long. Let me say this: they're comprehensive. If there were a funeral cover, there would be the comprehensive, right? Cover. If they're medical aid, there'd be the comprehensive. They are all week affair. Give everybody an opportunity to come and mourn and connect with the story. You put up a tent, and if you see the tent, if you don't come, then it's an offense to the family. In many of our contexts, the idea is that if you see the tent, right, and if you don't come, then you've declined an invitation, because the idea is if you know it's happening, then you're invited, And then you contrast that to a white funeral, and It shocks you. It shocks me as a black person how quickly it happens. White people bury very quickly. It makes you suspicious, doesn't it? It's just like, I'm not too sure if they loved this person, you know. But we're different. And then let me say this about before I get into everyday heroes. Say this about then you get to the colored funerals. In my family, we're mixed. Now it's incredible to me that in every other group, whether black, white, there's what you might call event appropriate food, right? You've got wedding food, that'll be here. Then you've got funeral food. Somewhere in between there, you've got 21st party, somewhere there. I think in both, that's what black people and white people have in common. Colored people just make good food no matter what the occasion is, right? It doesn't matter. It's like wedding food, funeral food, party food, Sunday afternoon food. Everything is just good food. Let's tell you something. You can leave here today. Test me on this. Leave here, this event. Find a colored family. Invite yourself, right? Just say, I'm coming over. They'll say, oh, look, I wasn't expecting you. I'm so sorry. And then just say, look, I'm just going to put a few things together. And it's a 3-course meal with a baked cheesecake. All right? That's colored people for you. But just to say, those are some of the things that I really enjoy. The good stuff about in South Africa, but we've also got some of the stuff that makes us feel a little anxious, like I said. Some of the things that really come from our historical narratives. Some things that make us feel entangled, make us feel in some ways that there's a bit of a stalemate. And I want to talk about today just the role, and in my view, and I appreciate the fact that there are some here who don't necessarily have this view or don't share the Christian faith, but I want to share conviction how, in my view, the person of Jesus Christ is unique in a way that he makes everyday heroes out of all of us, that in such a way that empowers us to act within our social narratives. I'm going to try and advance this argument through a series of stories, but also building on to what some of the speakers have already said. I really enjoyed this point about the church being the microcosm of the city. If we, that is the city and the church, lived like Jesus lived, that point hit home. Amongst many of the things that I learned from that, I really, that made an impact on me. And also the point of moving from the I to the we, from my to the our, from just personal to the corporate or the system. I think that's already the clue of what the unique contribution that Jesus can make in turning us into everyday heroes. Now, when I hear people talk about some of the conflicts, some of the social conflicts, and there are many avenues and many categories that give us some of these conflicts. Some of them, say, come from our political sphere. We're a young democracy. There's so many things that we're getting right, but there's so many missteps also. There's so many things that we should have gotten right already, some people tell us. And there's so many things as well that, realistically speaking, it's going to take a while for us to sort out, because it's a mess that's taken maybe hundreds of years to also create. And so, but from a political sphere, there are some issues that we definitely need to deal with that makes us anxious. But not only politically, but we also see socioeconomic. We see that there's so many people today who still feel like they're unable to meaningfully participate in the social and economic life of their country. And it causes them great distress, and they experience their country with a profound sense of a loss of dignity that we heard about today. A month ago, I think about a month ago, I live in Pushpak Ridge, which is next to the Kruger National Park. All the more reasons for you to visit my area. But remember, don't go to Limpopo, you're going to Mpumalanga. And I was talking to one of the rangers there, trying to take a shortcut in terms of seeing the important things when you get there. and talking to a ranger, and as we're having this conversation, he tells me about the prices of actually staying inside the Kruger. And he said, you know how expensive it is to actually stay overnight, not just to do the drive, but just to stay inside. And he says, you know, if I wasn't working here, I wouldn't be able to afford some of the best resources that my country has to offer. And as he talks, I can see this sense of this knock on dignity in terms of I want to be able to access the resources of my country, but because of our past, I'm unable to, because of the way I'm framed within the script. If you like, if you think about it as an analogy of a script, that our country had said for the longest time that this is a script and these are some of the heroes or the significant figures, and then you've got extras within the story. And many people today are still experiencing our country as extras within the story, while many of us are able to shift and move and change our roles based on the means and opportunities and resources that we have. But within that, you've also got some of the philosophical issues that we need to sort out. You know, is race an essential or not an essential thing? Because in one sense, I want to say, I don't want you to look at the color of my skin and think that you know who I am and treat me in a particular way. In that sense, I don't want it to be an essential part of, you know, who I am as a person. But at the same time, I want you to look at the color of my skin and know about the certain experiences that the color of my skin facilitates in my country, how I experience my country. So there's something essential about my lived experience within my country based on the color of my skin. But there's something that I want to say is also non-essential about who I am based on the color of my skin. So there's this sense. So when we talk about non-racialism and so forth, we're immediately tense, and we find these stalemates, these conflicts that we don't know how to navigate. So within those and more, there begins this cry that I hear a lot, that you have heard a lot. This cry for hope, this cry for saviors, this cry that may sound like this. I wonder, when is the next Nelson Mandela going to come? I wonder, when is the next fill in the gap with some great hero from the past who made an amazing contribution at some time in our country. It's a cry of hope. It's a cry almost, though, for superheroes. Excuse me. And it is at that point that I wish to depart from, to paint a picture of where my hope begins. Because when you look at the history of superheroes, you should actually have a look at the history of superheroes. You'll see that it was also exactly under similar conditions where there's despair and anxiety, a sense of bewilderment, uncertainty about the future, where people began to cry out for superheroes, or for at least symbols of hope that would be symbols of hope that things could change, things could get better. And it actually, when you think about the Great Depression and world wars, the great world wars, that's where what you call heroes like Superman were created. And if you see their roles as those icons to bring hope, you see also that it was, in the beginning, you had a cry for superheroes, and then superheroes began to emerge. And mostly these superheroes were superheroes from above. They transcended our world experience, our worldly experience. There were people we couldn't really touch. They were from beyond this world, like Superman, an alien from another planet who's come to save us. And then you started to see the emergence of other superheroes, a different kind of superhero that was from below. Superheroes from below that we could touch, that we could relate to. They were just like us as human beings, but they were still playing this role of saving us. Heroes from above and heroes from below. Then I started to think about the person of Jesus Christ, and I go, oh, well, you know what? If there's something intuitive in us that calls for a hero from above and heroes from below in the midst of despair, in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of anxiety, social anxiety, then maybe there is something also intuitive in looking at the person of Jesus Christ as representing both a hero from above and a hero from below. Because that's a biblical story. It paints a picture of a Christ who's out there, who comes from outside, but also comes from within, from below. Someone that we can touch. That somebody that John paints a picture of and says, he is that word of life that lends himself to us in such a way that our clumsy fingers can touch. But that gives me hope, because I find myself having conversations like this. I sit and I'm having dinner with some friends. And one friend has this outburst. He says, as an Afrikaner in this country, I feel like my identity is under attack. My culture and all the things that affirm my culture, like my language, are heavily scrutinized and are despised. On TV, on social media, in other spaces, in universities. I feel that I'm not even welcomed on the table of our national dialogue. I'm told that my responsibility is to feel ashamed of my whiteness, to repent of my white privilege, and to make restitution to a system that, doesn't differentiate between my hard work and my inheritance. And I really want to make a difference. I want to contribute economically, but I find I have no space to do so. I can't even define myself. Moreover, as an African, I'm told that I'll never be African enough, which means I've also lost my right to define myself in my own country. And he sat down. Then my other friend stood up and responded, black friend. He said, you know what? Friend, welcome to the reality of South Africa, and you should stop feeling sorry for yourself. You're only experiencing a small piece of what many black Africans have been experiencing for many generations. And as for your newfound freedom and your newfound desire to firstly be part of this national dialogue, you're not welcome, because in keeping with your colonialist attitude, you just want to dictate the terms of the dialogue. And also, this is just another way of further infantizing black people by playing the role of their helper and their savior. Then he sat down. And then, everyone on that table, it was just as tense as it is now in this room, right? But everybody on that table, all of a sudden, turns around and looks at me as though we've agreed that I'm the third speaker and it is my opportunity, it's my turn to respond. And I remember so many things going on in my head at that time. I remember thinking about how I'm going to respond, but most important of all those questions, who am I as I respond? Because I like us thinking about the big picture within the spheres that we represent and how we can apply ourselves in there to be heroes, to bring change that's going to bring relief to many people. When we break down, for instance, systems that are oppressive, and using business as a tool to do that, to bring about that change and relief, we're doing a good. When we take down things like slavery, present-day slavery, we're doing some amazing things. And I enjoy the fact that we've received really good input when it comes to this already. But one thing I want to add is, how do we become heroes when we are sitting and we are part of conversations like this around the braai every day? I want us to answer the question, how in every day do we become heroes when our domestic worker arrives, in our homes to come and help? Because it's one thing to talk about policy. It's another to say, how can I restore dignity by contributing to the education of my domestic workers' children, for instance. It's one thing to talk about policy, but it's another to say, I'm going to teach my children so that when they go to school, I'm going to disciple them so that when they go to school, they become agents of change, challenging a culture against bullying, for instance. This is what everyday hero stuff is made out of. So I find myself sitting on that table, not knowing how to respond, except this big question that's just pulsating, going through my mind. Who am I going to be as I respond? Am I a Christian who is black, who lives in Africa? Am I an African Christian who happens to be black? Am I a Christian who happens to be black, who happens to live in Africa? What is it about my layered identities in this moment challenges me and leaves me choking for an answer to respond to this and be a real everyday hero? Because here are my two friends that are framed from a culture, troubled, shared past, moving towards a vision of a shared, hopeful future. How do I do it? Share a little story. I'm in Soweto, and I was invited by Johannesburg Bible College to come and speak on traditional and contemporary African views of death. And I just finished my lecture. And then somebody had asked, they said, look, can we have some time for Q&A? And as the MC announces, it's time for Q&A, the first hand that goes up is from this beautiful Ukoko, granny. She raises her hand and she says to me, listen, I really appreciate that talk. And many people have told me, unrelated to your talk, many people have told me that I shouldn't believe in ghosts. I'm not really interested in that conversation, in that debate. What I would like to know is, what should we do with the ghosts that already haunt the townships every day? I understand there's a conversation about not believing in ghosts, and so I'm not interested in that. I just want to know what to do about the ghosts that already haunt the township every day. You know, that shifted my thinking quite a bit, that there is an important conversation that needs to happen at a theoretical level when we talk about these social conflicts and how we can be or act heroically within them. But then there is also the level of social imagery that we need to think about. The social imagery I'm talking about is the real feel experience that everyday people have of their country, their communities, our workspace, and so forth. That's really important to ask ourselves, how are we engaging within that, at that level where it touches people? Not at the level where we've had time to think about what the right response is. Maybe sitting on that table, you're putting yourself in my shoes and you're thinking this would be the right response, as opposed to maybe me being vulnerable and say, to be honest, the reflex surprised me, because that's the real feel of how I behave, who I am, before I've had an opportunity to think what is the right thing about that. And that's the important part. Why is that important? Because it speaks to me about how we need to both advance this conversation at a theoretical level so that we can and we can build a society systematically that basically challenges anything that challenges human flourishing. We talk about, Pastor Phil talks about building a church that builds a nation, right? That talks about thinking about how do we build a nation at both fronts, at the frontier, at the theoretical level, at a big picture level, but also at the same time, like bringing relief right now to people who need that relief, and therefore mobilizing armies of people who should live consistently with what they believe to bring about that change, that relief. But it also taught me that perhaps the teachers here, because, as I stood up and I took on the role of the teacher in that conversation and I gave that lecture, it was her question, Ukoko's question, that made me a student. With that one question, she shifted roles to say, I think maybe you should be sitting down and learning from me. And this has also been the problem, with being a hero in certain spaces, is because you see a need and you say, I want to help, I know exactly how I'm going to do it, and then you impose yourself. And then you further bring, a sense of loss of dignity to the people who are there. Meanwhile, they're wanting to be seen as people. You may be seeing them, for instance, as people or things to help or a project. All right. So in terms of bringing the right voices in the room, this is what I found exactly was so important. Now let me bring it together because I want to bring the argument pieces together. Enter Jesus. Many of us here have had an experience where you have a bin in your house, I hope. In my house, there's a small bin and there's also a big bin outside. The small bin is inside, the big bin is outside. And it's my job in my house to take the small bin outside and I empty it periodically. And then once a week, somebody comes and takes the big bin away. Now, imagine that I've neglected my duty and my responsibilities in taking out the small bin. And so there's all sorts of stuff that's piling up in the bin. All food pieces, and then over time there begins to be this rot, this mold, and perhaps maggots. I'm glad that we're having this talk before lunch. And so there are these maggots already that's just coming out of that bin, but it stinks. Now, South Africa is like this. There is this bin, right, in our society, this big bin, that hasn't been taken out for a long time. But this bin, not all of us live equal distances from the bin. There's some, the poor, who live right around the bin, so that whatever's inside the bin is also the reality of their environment, right? What's immediately outside the bin. So all the maggots immediately come out into their environment, for instance, and the mold and the stink and so forth. They can't distinguish. In fact, if you get close enough, you can't distinguish between in and around the bin. But then there's some of us, who live a bit further from the bin. So we're affected less by some of the mess that we talk about, what's in the bin. And we're not all affected equally, and some even live further and further. Some people even live in other rooms, if you like, if you stretch the analogy further. They live in other rooms in this house, such that it will take extraordinary circumstances for them to become aware of what actually is the bin in our country. And you know what? From time to time that happens. The temperature goes up, right? The heat goes up like the normal bin, and then the stink goes further than it would normally do. Right? It creeps in under some doors, right? And then all of a sudden, for instance, there are student protests, and the highway is blocked, and there are other things that are happening. Political decisions cause the rand and the markets to react negatively. And all of a sudden, the stink comes under somebody's room. And all of a sudden, we go, okay, with a greater voice as a society, we need to do something about it. Now, in doing something about it, there are various responses also. Sometimes we say, look, let's just contain it, right? Let's just make sure that it doesn't go beyond further than just around the bin. Let's just contain the mess to around the bin. But then we forget that there are those who live right next to the bin for whom their experience is actually what's in the bin is also what's in their lives. So sometimes we just contain it. But sometimes we then have a theoretical conversation, which is very interesting to me, but at the same time, I think that as a church, we should be above. But this is what it sounds like. So somebody gets an answer. You know what we should do? We should ask the question, who put the rubbish in the bin? And we should hold them accountable. So we're going to find them and we paint them and say, okay, you are guilty of putting rubbish in the bin. And then somebody says, no, wait, we should add to this list. Who was there when those who put the rubbish in the bin put the rubbish in the bin in the first place? Who was there? Okay, let's find them. All right, we find them and paint them. So you're responsible because you were there and so forth. And then the question moves on to say, wait. There's still a few more people that needs to be on this list. Okay, it's who has benefited from the rubbish being put in the bin in the first place? Because we need to hold them morally responsible. Some people going, yeah. Okay, then we find them and then we paint them and say, okay, we must find you morally responsible. And then we say, let's not stop there, right? Let's not stop there because it's been 23 years since, it's been somebody, we've had a change of management. So we should actually, whose responsibility was it to take out the rubbish from the bin for the past 23 years, and let's hold them accountable, and so forth. Now, these are important conversations to have. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm not belittling them. I think there's some merit to them. But this is how Jesus, if we put Jesus into the conversation, this is how he changes this conversation altogether. You see, the biblical story is that personally, as an individual, I had my own bin. and all the rubbish that were in that bin, I was responsible for putting in. I was not capable of doing anything about the rubbish in that bin. And then so what happens is Jesus looks at that. He has pity on me. He's moved with compassion. And then what he does, he says, you know what, I will do something about the rubbish that's in that bin. So he walks over to that bin with all the mold, with all the stink, with all the maggots, and then he takes it. But rather than just taking it outside, what he does is he takes that bin and then he empties it on himself. He takes all of that rubbish onto himself in such a way, he becomes so intimate with the rubbish in such a way that if you saw my rubbish, you'd no longer say it was my rubbish, you'd see that rubbish on him and you'd say it was his rubbish. And then with a smile on his face, then he walks over to the cross. And then he says, I'm doing something to take out Mahlatse's rubbish. And then he turns around when that is done, and he says, just as you've been treated, here's the template, just as you've been treated, this is how you treat other people. Just as I've done for you, this is what you do, because it's part of a bigger story. It's part of what I am doing. It's part of what I am doing in general in my cosmos, to repair, to rebuild, to fix my cosmos. And you know what? You are somebody who's benefited from that. Now come and partner with me as we do it together. So regardless of where I find myself, I now think about where is the mess in God's cosmos. I now think, where is the rot? Where is the maggot? Where are the maggots? I've got to deal with them. And then you know what? He does in three ways that really can untangle, or rather, let me say, empower me, because it means that in my immediate community, whether it's in my neighborhood here in Century City where I live, or whether it's in my work, in my office space, or whether it's where I travel and I meet different people, whatever sphere you find yourself, three things that might help you in the way he does it. Number one is to touch the imagination. Rather than accepting that things are what they are, Jesus Christ gives me the vision that they could be different and they should be different. And this is really important, because as Marius was reading the preamble, I asked myself, what are the philosophical assumptions that are actually undergirding some of the statements that we're making? When we talk about human dignity and we say it's inherent, and we talk about worth and say it's inherent, we've got to ask ourselves philosophically, how do we sustain inherent dignity and inherent worth if the story is different than the biblical story, which is a human being is created in the image of God. And that's where he gets philosophically his worth and his dignity. Remove God, where do we get worth and dignity that's inherent? Because the Constitution does not bestow that upon any individual. It touches the imagination to look at our society and say, things shouldn't be this way. I don't have to accept that things should be this way. I can change. I can be an actor and I can change. It also then issues an ethical summons, not just touches the imagination. It's one thing to say things should be different, but try to think it should be somebody else's problem. You can think it's somebody else's problem. And I'm seeing so many people, and you find out what I'm talking about by asking, whose responsibility is it to fix these issues? And you'll hear government, you'll hear, this group of people or that group of people. Again, let me bring you to that vision that Phil brings up, to build a church that builds a nation. He has taken responsibility and says, you know what, I see it as a part of our responsibility as the church to actually play an active role, an active part in building this nation. So guess what happens when things aren't done within Phil and Phil's church's community? When there are things that are not being done. Not that they won't hold people responsible, but because they've tied themselves so much to the problem and to therefore the solution, they don't play the blame game. They look at it and say, that's an opportunity where other people have failed, even those who are responsible by the Constitution. When they have failed, we still see an opportunity for us to be everyday heroes, acting to bring human flourishment, to bring change, to build this nation. But there's an ethical summons. Jesus looks and says there is a responsibility that is placed on those who have found mercy, on those who have found justice through Christ, then to be agents of justice in their own communities and in their spheres. There's also a difference. You see, that's another thing. If you just only are touched in the imagination to say, things shouldn't be this way, things should be different, but you don't actually see yourself as somebody who needs to actually do something about it, then you could also fall in a trap where you begin to moralize, where you all you do is point out what is wrong, but you don't see yourself. You remove yourself from the responsibility of doing something about it. And therefore, you're not moved with compassion. You just move just to moralize the whole time. And you know what it's like to be at a braai with people who can moralize all the time. They just tell you about everything that is wrong, that everybody is doing wrong, but never see themselves as any way an effective agent of change or that can bring about that change. Then also, it's not just touched in the imagination, and receiving an ethical summons, but it is also necessary to have the provision for, or being empowered to act in order for it to be an everyday hero. Because you can see something, and you can say, I want to act, but you can say, I don't know how to. I don't have the energy to. I don't have the inspiration to. I don't have the means to. And this is where I find also Christ has something so meaningful to do, to say, and help us to do. Because, you see, we'll be listening to stories today for the rest of the day of people who are actually doing it. People who, in the everyday, in their spheres, are actually the embodiment of what we're talking about. And you'll see that in their stories, one of the things that we'll find is the sense of resources that God has brought alongside them, because He not only calls us to do the right thing, but He empowers us to be able to do the right thing. This is the definition of true freedom. To also, part of it is to be empowered to do the right thing. Not only to want the right thing or to see the right thing, but to be empowered to be able to be an actor so that you actually do the right thing as well. And so you'll see the resources, and some of them, the resources, for some of us, maybe the resource is exactly this conference. Listening to Mr. Fletcher, you're thinking, man, I'm so empowered with this model that he presented, or the theology that he presented within this particular section of technology, that I can see myself answering the question, the problems of our society, but thinking through innovation, for instance. Maybe that's the resources that you needed. That some of us, maybe it's the resources to hear that other people are doing it, therefore you can do it too. Other people is the resources of this church itself. Maybe you're plugged into this church and you're saying on other churches, other communities that have the similar vision. And you're saying, how can we do it together? Because if it's sometimes scary to do it alone, perhaps we need to be with others and then take those few steps. It says you are not alone. You don't have to be alone. You're part of a bigger story. And you can have the resources that affords, being part of a bigger story that can afford in order for you to do that. But then there's the actual, even the elements, the narrative elements in the Jesus Christ story itself that I want to leave us here with this afternoon. Jesus Christ died, and then He rose from the dead. He was born, He died, or lived, He died, He rose from the dead. I've been thinking about one of the troubled issues, things that, or rather, let me say, one of the things that troubled me most about what troubles people most is the fact that people are hurting right now and they need relief right now. And we're going to get out of here and hopefully inspired to do so many things that are going to really bring relief to people. But we should also not forget that comfort is so important in giving to communities, whether it's Bronkhorstspruit or other communities that we find ourselves in. Comfort is important about what's happened in the past, about what's happening today, about the future, that still some bad things will happen in the future, but in Christ I find we have real resources that can do that. I'll leave you with a simple illustration. You know, when my daughter was born, as a parent, you want to do everything right. Just because you don't want to kill your child. You're just trying to keep your child alive. You're saying, I read every book, that I could. I did my research. But there was this one thing where I had to think about taking my child to go and get vaccinated. Man, it brought such conflict to me as a father, because I thought, I am taking my child to go and experience pain. The size of that needle, the needle relative to the size of my child's arm. It just seems so unfair. And then, I had so many good reasons why I was thinking I should do it. It was a good idea to do it. But I realized it was very difficult for me to communicate that to my daughter at that time. Not because of my inability to communicate, but because of her inability to understand anything that I would say that is meaningful. But I decided what I was going to do is I was going to be there, and so that when I see that look of pain, of bewilderment, of anxiety, that look that says, why? That I'm going to put my arms around her and say, it's okay, Papa is here. This is what the cross of Christ has done to us and enables us to be everyday heroes. You see, it tells a story about a God who was not just content in just sitting outside when he saw humans suffering, but he got involved intimately. He became born into his creation, and he suffered alongside of us. Not only did he suffer alongside of us, but he also suffers for us. He suffers because of us. But not only because of us, but through his suffering, we have access to real comfort. We have access because our relationship with God is restored, but we have the meaningful resources that we need. If you've ever held a victim of a violent crime, or you've been one yourself, and you can feel that person shivering still from the trauma, that you know that all the words that you can say are not sufficient, but what is meaningful at that time is real comfort that only God can bring. And because of what he has done, we have real access to real comfort and a message that to a suffering world that can bring hope. So in the message of the cross, we see Christ himself, we see God himself putting out his big arms around us and saying, you know what? It's okay, Papa is here. That enables you and I then to do the same, to extend the fingers of Jesus into a suffering world and say, I want to be an everyday hero by extending those arms, those fingers, and say, it's okay, Emmanuel, Papa is here. Thank you.